Welcome in, everybody. We're diving deep today into the mind of Morgan Housel and his book, The Psychology of Money. We've got some really interesting excerpts here. We'll be focusing on behavioral finance, the whole luck versus skill debate, and then also these surprising ways that, like, our personal histories can actually shape our money decisions.
Hmm.
So are you ready to unlock these secrets to building real sustainable wealth through, better financial behavior?
Oh, absolutely. I think what's so fascinating about House's whole approach is that he really emphasizes understanding the why behind our choices when it comes to money, right? Like he argues that mastering the psychological side of things, that game, is just as important, if not more important, than understanding all the technical stuff.
Okay, so let's break that down a little bit. You're saying it's not just about like picking the right stocks or timing the market perfectly. There's this whole deeper level of understanding our own like behaviors and motivations around money.
Yeah, exactly. One of House's most compelling arguments is that like everyone's financial decisions, they make sense to them in that moment, right? It's all about their own unique life experiences and how those experiences have shaped their perception of risk and reward and even like what money represents to them in the first place.
Gotcha. Can you give us like a real world example of how this actually plays out?
Okay, so think about lottery tickets. Americans spend more on lottery tickets every year than on movies, video games, music, sporting events, and books combined. And like, it's not just some random spending habit either. Lower income households, they spend 4 times more on lottery tickets than the highest income groups.
Wow. That's actually a pretty wild statistic. So what's driving that behavior? Especially like in households that might already be kind of struggling financially?
Right. Well, Housel would argue that it's not really about being irrational. It's about these differing perceptions of risk, right? That are totally shaped by their personal history. People who have faced, consistent financial hardship, they might see a lottery ticket as like their only shot at breaking free from that cycle. It's a long shot, of course, but it's like this little glimmer of hope in a reality where other paths to wealth seem like they're completely out of reach.
So you're saying their decision-making is driven by a really powerful emotional need, even if it might not necessarily make sense from a purely like statistical or financial planning perspective?
Yeah.
Okay. What's the key takeaway here then for our listeners? How can understanding this concept help them make better financial decisions in their own lives?
Yeah. Well, I think it all starts with recognizing that like our past experiences can create these blind spots in our financial decision making.
Yeah.
We might be unconsciously repeating patterns that don't serve us anymore, or like taking on way too much risk just because it feels familiar somehow. So the first step is just awareness. Like, ask yourself, are my financial decisions driven by logic and a clear assessment of my situation? Or are they being influenced by past experiences that might be kind of clouding my judgment a bit?
Okay. So it's like doing a personal like financial audit, not just of our accounts, but also of our beliefs and attitudes towards money.
Yeah.
Interesting. This kind of leads us to another one of Housel's fascinating concepts, this whole balance of luck and skill. I know you're a big fan of his Bill Gates anecdote to kind of illustrate this point.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Housel really drives home the point that, while talent and hard work are obviously important, luck and risk play huge roles in financial success, often way more than we're even willing to admit.
I can already hear some of our listeners rolling their eyes like, here we go, another excuse for why some people just get lucky. How does Housel address that kind of pushback?
Well, he uses Bill Gates as like the perfect example, not to diminish, Gates's brilliance or anything, but to highlight the role of luck, which can be so easily overlooked. So Housel points out that only 1 in a million high school students had the opportunity to go to Lakeside School, this exclusive private school. And it just so happened to be the place where Gates had access to like cutting edge computing resources back in, the early days of personal computers. And like that access was this totally pivotal moment in his whole journey with Microsoft, right?
Okay, so yeah, that's a pretty incredible stroke of luck. But surely Gates's success can't be attributed solely to just being in the right place at the right time. He still had to have the vision and the drive to capitalize on that, right?
Right. Absolutely. Housel acknowledges Gates's undeniable talent and ambition, 100%. But then he brings up Gates's friend, Kent Evans.
Yeah.
This guy was equally brilliant, equally driven, but he tragically died in a climbing accident. And this comparison, It's so poignant, really underscores this unpredictable nature of risk and how events completely outside of our control can just totally derail even the most promising trajectories.
Man, that's a powerful reminder that we're not always in the driver's seat no matter how much we plan or how hard we work.
It's true.
So how does this understanding of luck and risk actually help us make better financial decisions?
Yeah.
I mean, it's not about just throwing up our hands and saying, well, it's all up to chance anyway.
Right. It's not about giving up control. I think it's more about cultivating like a healthy dose of humility
Yeah.
and avoiding that trap of judging success just based on outcomes. Recognizing the role of luck helps us make more informed decisions, manage our expectations, and avoid taking unnecessary risks that could just wipe us out.
So it's about being strategic, yeah, but also being prepared for those curveballs that life inevitably throws our way.
For sure.
Now, speaking of long-term strategies, Housel is like a huge advocate for the power of time and the magic of compounding, right?
Oh, absolutely. He argues that the biggest factor in wealth accumulation isn't necessarily earning like these crazy high returns, but simply giving your investments the time to grow. Like he uses Warren Buffett as a prime example, highlighting how like the vast majority of Buffett's wealth, it was accumulated after he turned 60, thanks to the exponential power of compounding over decades.
That's incredible. So even for like the Oracle of Omaha, patience was the secret ingredient.
Hmm?
What's the key takeaway here then for, our listeners? How can they harness this power of compounding in their own lives?
I think the most important step is to just start investing early and consistently, even if you can only contribute a small amount at first. Time is your greatest ally in the compounding game. Think of it like planting a tree. The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is today.
I love that analogy. It really captures the essence of long-term thinking. But let's be real. Patience isn't always easy, especially in today's world where everything is instant gratification, right? We're constantly bombarded with messages to buy now, spend now, upgrade now. How do we actually cultivate that patience needed to let compounding work its magic?
Well, that's where House's insights on the psychology of saving come into play, right? He argues that saving isn't just about, like, socking away money for a rainy day. It's about developing this whole mindset of delayed gratification and recognizing that true wealth is built over time, not overnight.
So it's as much a mental game as it is a financial strategy.
Exactly.
How do we actually shift our thinking to embrace this, long-term perspective then?
Well, one powerful strategy Housel suggests is to focus on what you're gaining by saving, not just what you're giving up. So instead of viewing saving as this deprivation, try to frame it as an investment in your future freedom and security. It really is, yeah. It's like you're shifting from like a scarcity mindset to an abundance mindset. Instead of feeling restricted by saving, you actually start to feel empowered because you're in control, you're taking control of your financial future.
Like you're buying freedom, not just stuff.
I like that. Speaking of freedom, one of Housel's most intriguing concepts, at least to me, is this idea of being pretty reasonable with money.
Mm-hmm.
And seems kind of counterintuitive at first, right? Like, shouldn't we always be striving for perfect rationality when it comes to our finances?
Well, Housel argues that while rationality is important, of course, it's also super crucial to acknowledge that we're humans, not robots. We've got emotions, biases, and just individual circumstances that color our financial decisions, even if they don't perfectly align with all the theoretical models out there. So it's about finding that balance between being financially savvy and, just being human, right? Like not beating ourselves up for those inevitable moments of emotional spending or investment choices that aren't like textbook perfect.
Totally. He calls this pretty reasonable. So creating a financial plan that you can actually stick with for the long haul, even if it means like occasionally deviating from pure rationality just to accommodate your personal circumstances or your emotional well-being, right? So he actually uses this example of the Nobel Prize-winning economist Harry Markowitz, who he developed this really complex model for portfolio optimization, but guess what? He didn't even follow it himself.
Wait, so the guy who literally won a Nobel Prize for figuring out the most rational investment strategy didn't even use it for his own money?
Right.
I feel like there's got to be a good story there.
Oh, there totally is. So Markowitz admitted that he just chose a much simpler approach for his own investments, one that gave him, peace of mind. He just split his money like 50-50 between stocks and bonds. And yeah, that strategy, maybe it wasn't mathematically optimal or whatever, but it allowed him to sleep at night. He understood that the perfect financial plan, it means nothing if you can't actually commit to it emotionally.
That's huge. That right there is a massive takeaway for our listeners, I think. It's not about finding some abstract one-size-fits-all approach, but rather figuring out what actually works for you, your personality, your risk tolerance, even if it means like bending the rules of perfect financial rationality a little bit.
Exactly. Exactly. And like this principle applies to every area of personal finance, investing, saving, managing debt, all of it. It's about finding that sustainable approach that aligns with your values and helps you achieve your goals, without sacrificing your mental and emotional well-being along the way.
Love that. Okay, let's talk about another big theme in Housel's work, the whole role of personal history. I mean, it seems kind of obvious that our past experiences would influence our money decisions, but Housel really takes it to a whole new level.
Oh, totally. He argues that our unique life stories, they shape our whole financial worldview, sometimes in ways that we don't even realize. Everything from our childhood experiences to the economic climate we grew up in, it can influence our risk tolerance, our spending habits, even just our beliefs about what money even is.
I can imagine our listeners right now thinking, okay, so how do I actually apply this concept? Should I like start digging through old photo albums to uncover some hidden financial traumas or something?
It doesn't have to be that literal, but it is definitely worth reflecting on how your past might be shaping your financial behavior in the present, right?
Hmm.
So, like, for example, if you grew up in a household where, money was always tight, you might be more likely to hoard savings or just avoid taking any risks at all, even if those risks could actually be beneficial for you in the long run.
Or on the flip side, if you saw your parents, achieve financial success through entrepreneurship or something, you might be more inclined to take those calculated risks, maybe invest in your own ventures, things like that.
Exactly. It's all about recognizing these patterns and then just like asking yourself, are they actually serving me well right now? Or are they holding me back in some way? Are my financial decisions based on, a rational assessment of my current circumstances? Or are they like these echoes of the past?
It's like you're becoming a financial archaeologist of your own life,
Mm.
excavating those buried beliefs and habits that might be driving your money decisions under the surface.
Yeah.
So let's say you've done that excavation. What's the next step then?
Well, I think it's about challenging those old, outdated scripts and kind of reframing your whole relationship with money, right? If you're stuck in that scarcity mindset because of past experiences, start by focusing on your financial wins, no matter how small. And if you're like averse to risk because you witnessed some financial setback or something, maybe start exploring ways to take like calculated risks, but that align with your goals and your risk tolerance, of course.
So it's all about rewriting the narrative, like not letting our past totally dictate our financial future, right?
Totally.
This brings us to another one of Housel's really powerful concepts, this idea that we're often like really bad at predicting our future selves.
Oh, it's so true, isn't it? We tend to make these financial decisions based on who we are today without fully considering how our values and our priorities, even our circumstances, they might evolve over time.
I think we've all fallen victim to this end of history illusion at some point. That feeling of like, this is it. I finally figured it all out. This is who I am and this is what I want. And then bam, life throws a curveball and your carefully crafted plan just doesn't fit anymore.
Right. And Housel, he argues that this illusion can lead to, like, making these financial decisions that our future selves might totally regret. He uses this analogy. It's so simple but brilliant. He says, a child might dream of being a tractor driver when they grow up, only to realize later on that their passion lies in, something completely different. So we have to be flexible enough to adapt our financial plans as our lives unfold.
Okay, so how do we avoid making those kinds of financial commitments that our future selves are going to want to hop in a time machine and like undo?
Well, Hassels has a couple of suggestions. First, just like regularly revisit your goals and your plans. Like actually ask yourself, do they still align with my priorities, my aspirations, with who I am now?
So don't be afraid to course correct.
Exactly. Your life is a journey, not a destination. Your financial plan should be like a roadmap that guides you along the way, not, some rigid set of rules that prevents you from exploring those new paths as they emerge.
I like that. It's really freeing, that perspective, giving ourselves permission to evolve and adapt, not feeling like we're trapped by decisions we made in the past. What are some other strategies for, avoiding those financial future regrets?
Well, he also encourages us to avoid making those big, irreversible financial decisions, especially when we're young. Like, for instance, don't feel pressured to buy a house just because, everyone else is doing it. Or don't lock yourself into a career path that you might absolutely hate 5, 10 years down the road.
It's about maintaining that flexibility and like optionality, giving ourselves the freedom to change our minds as we learn and grow.
Hmm.
Speaking of learning and growing, let's talk about another big theme in Housel's work. This whole importance of understanding and harnessing the power of narratives.
Ooh, yeah. This is where things get really interesting. So, Housel, he argues that, like, we're all wired to try to make sense of the world through stories. And these stories, these narratives, they totally shape our financial decisions. Often, again, in ways that we don't even realize.
Okay, so I need a little help here. We're talking about like actual stories,
Yeah.
like fairy tales and novels. How do those things actually impact our choices about money?
Not necessarily like fictional stories, but more the stories that we tell ourselves and the stories that we hear from other people about money, success, risk, the economy, all that stuff. And these narratives, they can be so incredibly powerful because they give us this framework for understanding like complex information and for making decisions when we're faced with uncertainty.
Can you give us like a real world example of how this actually plays out?
Okay, so think about the whole narrative around the housing market in the years leading up to the 2008 financial crisis. The prevailing story was that like housing prices always go up, that real estate was like a foolproof investment.
Buy low, sell high. That was the golden rule, right?
Exactly. And that narrative, that story, it drove so many people to make these huge financial decisions, taking on way more debt than they could actually handle because they just assumed those ever-rising housing prices would bail them out eventually.
But of course, the narrative was flawed.
Right.
The bubble burst, and we all saw how devastating those consequences were.
Exactly. And it just highlights how important it is to actually critically evaluate those narratives that are shaping our financial decisions. Are they based on solid evidence, a balanced perspective, a realistic assessment of risk? Or are they just, comforting fictions that could totally lead us astray?
So it's about becoming savvy consumers of financial information. Like, not just blindly accepting the prevailing narratives, no matter how persuasive they might seem.
Exactly.
Challenge the assumptions.
Yeah.
Ask questions. Seek out those diverse perspectives. Don't get swept up in a story that could end really badly. Speaking of stories, let's shift gears and talk about this particularly potent narrative that Housel explores.
Yeah.
This enduring power of pessimism.
Yeah.
This is really fascinating to me because it seems like bad news always travels faster
Yeah.
and it sticks with us longer than good news. Why? Why do you think that is?
Well, Housel offers a few explanations for this. First, he argues that negative events they grab our attention more than, those gradual improvements. Like, our brains are kind of wired to focus on threats, right? And financial threats, those are, like, especially salient. So, like, a stock market crash, that makes headlines, right? But a slow and steady bull market, that's just, it's less dramatic.
It's like that saying, if it bleeds, it leads. We're drawn to the sensational, even if it, totally distorts our perception of reality.
Exactly. And Housel also points out that, like, pessimists, they often extrapolate current trends without really considering how markets and people adapt over time.
Yeah.
So they see a problem and they assume it's just going to keep getting worse and worse. They're ignoring the human capacity for innovation, for problem solving, for resilience.
They're failing to account for the possibility of a positive turnaround, right?
Totally.
Can you give us an example of how this plays out, in the real world?
Sure. So Housel talks about the case of oil prices back in the early 2000s. So a lot of experts at that time, they were predicting that we were rapidly running out of oil and that prices were just going to skyrocket to these crazy, unsustainable levels, leading to, an economic catastrophe.
Peak oil. That was a pretty scary narrative.
It was, but what those predictions, they totally failed to account for was human ingenuity, right? So the development of fracking technology that opened up all these vast new reserves of oil and prices actually stabilized.
So the pessimists basically missed the plot twist. They underestimated our ability to innovate and adapt.
Exactly. And this happens time and time again. We get so caught up in this narrative of doom and gloom, only to find out later that things aren't nearly as dire as they seemed.
So what's the takeaway here for our listeners then? How do we avoid falling prey to those, overly pessimistic narratives?
Well, Housel encourages us to just be more skeptical of those doom and gloom predictions. He reminds us that, human history, it's a story of progress, even amidst the setbacks.
So it's about maintaining a balanced perspective, acknowledging the challenges, but also recognizing our capacity to overcome them.
Exactly. It's about being informed, but not letting that fear paralyze us.
That's a great message to carry with us as we, try to navigate all the complexities of personal finance. Now, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to circle back to a concept that you mentioned earlier, one that really resonated with me, this idea of luck and skill in financial success.
Oh, yeah. I'm glad you brought that up because it's something that people love to debate, right?
Totally. Some people believe that financial success is, primarily a result of just hard work and talent,
Yeah. Hmm.
while others argue that, like, luck plays a much bigger role than we're willing to admit. So where does Housel actually land in this whole debate?
Well, I think he takes kind of a nuanced approach, right? He acknowledges that both skill and luck are essential ingredients, like they're both in the recipe for financial success. And he argues that it's often just really difficult to like disentangle the two because they tend to interact in these really complex ways.
Can you give us like an example of how this interplay of luck and skill might actually play out in the real world?
Sure. So imagine two entrepreneurs who launch startups at the same time. They both have great ideas. They both have a really strong work ethic. They both have supportive networks, right? But one entrepreneur, they just happen to get lucky. Like they launch their product at the exact moment that this like new market trend emerges and it propels them to, super rapid success. The other entrepreneur, they might face all these like unexpected challenges, a sudden economic downturn, a competitor with a similar product, and it just makes their path to success so much more difficult.
So even with like equal levels of talent and effort, luck can really play a decisive role in determining those outcomes.
Exactly. And Housel argues that just recognizing this reality can help us approach financial success with more humility.
It's about acknowledging that we're not always in complete control, and that sometimes, despite our best efforts, things just might not go our way.
Totally. And that understanding can be so liberating because it takes off all that pressure, right, of believing that we're solely responsible for every outcome.
It encourages us to be more compassionate, too.
Yeah.
Like both with ourselves and with others when we face setbacks, right?
Yeah, right.
Instead of beating ourselves up for, perceived failures, we can just recognize that sometimes, hey, luck just wasn't on our side.
Exactly. And that recognition can really help us bounce back from that adversity and approach future challenges with like a more balanced perspective.
It's about embracing the uncertainty that's inherent in life, right? Recognizing that even with the best planning and execution, there's always an element of chance.
Mm-hmm.
Now, before we move on to the final part of our deep dive, I want to circle back to a concept that you mentioned earlier that really resonated with me. This idea that our personal histories can shape our financial worldviews in ways that we don't even realize.
I love that you brought that back up. It's so crucial, right?
Yeah. And I think it's especially relevant like right now as we're navigating this period of, significant economic uncertainty and volatility. How can our listeners use this understanding of personal history to like actually make more informed decisions in this current climate?
Well, I think it all starts with self-awareness, right? Like take some time to really reflect on your own financial journey. Think about your earliest experiences with money. How did your family talk about finances? What economic events like really shaped your formative years?
Like you're conducting this personal financial archaeology expedition, right?
Yeah.
Digging into those buried layers of experience that might be influencing your decisions right now in the present day.
Exactly. And once you've unearthed those experiences, ask yourself how they might be like shaping your current financial behaviors, right? Are you overly cautious with money because you witnessed your parents struggling financially? Are you prone to like impulse spending because you grew up with a sense of abundance?
It's about recognizing those patterns and asking yourself, are they serving me well or are they holding me back?
Exactly. And if you realize that, certain patterns aren't aligned with your current goals and values, you can start to like consciously rewrite those scripts.
So it's not about being a prisoner of your past, but using that self-awareness as like a springboard for growth and change.
Yes, exactly. And by understanding those deep connections between, our personal histories and our financial behaviors, we can make more empowered choices that align with our true values and aspirations.
This has been so illuminating. I'm already feeling like more equipped to navigate this whole world of personal finance. I feel like I have a deeper understanding of those psychological forces that are at play.
I'm so glad to hear that. And honestly, we've really only scratched the surface here. Housel's book, The Psychology of Money, it's full of so much wisdom.
Well, lucky for us, we have one more part of our deep dive to go. We'll continue exploring Housel's insights and discuss how our listeners can actually apply these principles to, build a brighter financial future. Welcome back, everybody, to our deep dive into Morgan Housel's The Psychology of Money. I'm so excited to wrap up this conversation and unpack even more of his amazing insights.
Me too. This book is seriously a gold mine of wisdom, you know? It's not just about the technical stuff, it's about the psychology behind our money choices.
Exactly. And this last part of our deep dive, I want to focus on some of the actionable takeaways, right? The things our listeners can actually apply to their own financial lives.
Love it. I think one of the most important things Housel talks about is figuring out what enough actually looks like for you.
Yeah, I love that concept because it really challenges this idea that more is always better. In a world where we're constantly bombarded with messages to buy, achieve, 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 it's so easy to get caught up in that endless chase for more.
It really is. And Housel's point is that this chase can actually make us less happy. He wants us to step back and ask, what really matters? What brings me joy? How much money do I actually need to live a life that I love?
It's about aligning our financial goals with our deepest desires, right?
Totally.
Not about denying ourselves or living like a monk or anything, but just being intentional about how we use money to create a life that feels really, truly rich and meaningful.
100%. And once you define what enough is for you, it's so much easier to make decisions that support that vision. You're not chasing some random goal or comparing yourself to everyone else. You're just focused on what matters to you.
It's like you're creating your own personal financial roadmap, leading you to a destination that actually feels right. Speaking of roadmaps, I know Housel's a big fan of having a financial plan, but he also cautions against being too rigid, too stuck in our ways.
Yeah, he's all about balance. Having a plan is super important, but being flexible and adaptable is just as important. Life throws curveballs, our goals change, you know?
He has this great analogy, right? Something about driving at night.
Yes. He says planning is like driving a car at night. You can only see as far as your headlights, but you can make the whole trip that way. You don't need to have every single detail of your financial future planned out, just a general direction.
That's such a relief to hear, especially for people who get overwhelmed by the whole financial planning thing. It's about taking it step by step, making the best decisions you can right now, and being open to adjusting course along the way.
Exactly. And he stresses this flexibility, especially when it comes to investing. The most successful investors are the ones who adapt to changing market conditions, you know?
So it's not about finding that perfect strategy and sticking to it no matter what. It's about being nimble, being responsive to new information.
Exactly. And that takes a willingness to learn and grow, to challenge what you think you know, and be open to new ideas.
It's a growth mindset, not just with our money, but with our whole lives. Speaking of growth, Housel's a big believer in the power of compounding, right? Not just with our investments, but with our knowledge and skills, too.
Oh, absolutely. One of the best investments you can make is in yourself. The more you learn, the more doors open up for you.
It's about building human capital, not just financial capital, right?
Yeah, totally. And that kind of investment pays off no matter what the stock market is doing.
It's like building a foundation that can withstand anything.
Mm-hmm. And it's never too late to start, take a class, read a book, talk to people who inspire you. There are so many ways to keep learning and growing.
It's all about that lifelong love of learning. So as we wrap up our deep dive into Morgan Housel's work, I want to leave everyone with this. Financial well-being isn't just about the numbers. It's about building a life that feels rich and meaningful, that reflects what you truly value.
So well said. It's about using money as a tool to empower us, not letting it control us or define our worth.
Finding that perfect intersection of financial security and personal fulfillment.
Exactly. And that's a goal worth striving for.
Absolutely. And if you want to explore Housel's ideas in more depth, definitely check out his book, The Psychology of Money. It's a game changer. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. We'll see you next time.